For startups hiring engineers and engineers looking to join them, this podcast is for you.
Hi, welcome to Your Next Tech Startup. I'm host Isabel Rasmussen. I bring a decade of technical recruitment. And today we are going to be diving into a new topic, which is the psychology of startup culture, with a focus on how candidates can assess psychological safety before they sign on. Joining us is Dr. Matthew Jones, a former psychologist turned founder coach who's worked with hundreds of startup teams from seed to Series C. We'll talk through why communication dynamics matter so much, the red flags to watch out for, and smart questions job seekers can ask to determine if they're going to be finding themselves in a healthy work environment. So first off, let's just define psychological safety in a work environment.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to have this conversation because I think psychological safety is one of the most overlooked aspects of interviewing at different companies, especially within startup companies. Broadly, I think psychological safety is the belief that you're not going to be punished or humiliated or penalized for speaking up or asking questions or challenging the status quo. And so, like, for example, if you're in a psychologically safe team, you can say things like, I'm confused, I disagree, I see it differently, here's how I'm thinking about it. And that's not going to show up in your performance review. And so it's not about like pretending that everyone is nice or that we don't have conflict or disagreement. It's more that there's an ability to be open and honest without being penalized for that. And so it shows up in a lot of like small moments, right? Where like if people interrupt, or how mistakes are handled or not handled, and whether there's room for that disagreement that can actually be really healthy and productive for teams.
Yeah, and I think psychological safety plays such a big part in why people decide to leave roles. But you're 100% right. Like, I don't know if I've ever heard, I don't think a candidate would articulate it that way, but like, will I have psychological safety in this role? Like typically just people talk about communication, I want to be in a collaborative work environment. But really for communication and collaboration to function well, you have to have psychological safety. And you can pretend, I think, to have strong communication, but you can't really pretend with psychological safety.
I completely agree. It's something that people feel and express outwardly through, the ability, for example, to do what I'm doing right now, where I'm just articulating off the top of my head what's coming to mind. Because I for you and I, it's like I have a degree of psychological safety here. There's team environments where that is absolutely not permitted, and you will feel the sense of anxiety in your chest and tightness of, oh, should I say this thing? Like I think I have an idea here, but I'm actually afraid that if I vocalize it, it's not going to be received well, or the room's going to laugh at me, or whatever the case may be. And I've worked in teams like that, and it's a horrible feeling. And then that team actually underperforms because they're not getting the buy-in and the ideas and the iteration that comes from a team that has psychological safety in place.
Yeah. And as you're saying that, I think about how it is so hard to feel any realm of psychological safety when you're interviewing. And when I interview people, I try to create that because I want to get a sense of like who their authentic self is to, best determine if they're going to be a fit or not for a role. But it is something that is incredibly challenging to create very quickly. And so, so candidates are dealing with that when they're interviewing. And then now we're talking about, okay, you have to deal with the fact that you probably don't feel safe, right? In that moment, yet how do you assess psychological safety so that when you are in the role, you can feel safe? Let's, talk a bit about leadership. So obviously leadership significantly influences and shapes the culture of an organization. You focus on supporting co-founder and the dynamics between them. So what are some of those kind of day-to-day dynamics that end up really impacting employees?
Let me start by saying that as a licensed psychologist and co-founder coach, and this is certainly my bias, I think the co-founder relationship is the most important relationship in business because there's no other relationship that can both be an existential threat to your company's existence and be the foundation of a healthy culture that allows you to perform and continue scaling. As it pertains specifically to this aspect of psychological safety and kind of the broader culture, what I see is that the patterns that take place within the founding team ripple out and impact everyone else in terms of how they show up and whether or not psychological safety is present. To be more specific, I work with teams often where there's a degree of, let's say, like disagreement or friction happening. And so, to name a common pattern, let's say
And
that
just to clarify, when you say you
yeah.
work with teams where there's disagreement, um, are you referring to like the disagreement between the co-founders or disagreement amongst like the entire team?
Typically, what I'm referring to is the co-founders, but I'm
Okay.
going to try to articulate in a second why it does show up and how it shows up in the rest of the team. So,
Oh, I've seen it. But yeah.
yeah, I bet I would love to hear that. I would love to hear about it. I mean, just to give you an example, and then I'd be curious to hear your perspective as well. What I've seen is let's say that the CEO is continuing to grow and evolve in their role, and they just closed their Series A, and things are accelerating. They're bringing in more and more talent to the team, and then the CTO, let's just kind of using a stereotype here, the CTO is not scaling in their role in the same capacity. Then part of what can happen, especially if there's like personality dynamics where the CEO tried to give the CTO some feedback and that wasn't received super well, is more or less the feedback breaks down, the communication stops. And so then the CEO stops giving feedback to the CTO. And yet other people see the underperformance or the challenges becoming a manager instead of an individual contributor. And then all of a sudden, part of what happens culturally is there become these informal norms where the norm is no longer to give the CTO direct feedback. The norm is to go around that person and speak to the CEO. And then the CEO is in this weird position where they either validate it and affirm, yeah, I see what you see, which makes the whole problem worse, or they try to kind of have their co-founders back without negating the experience of the employee who's bringing the issue. And so that's an example where there's kind of a cultural erosion because there's being conflict that's avoided at the co-founder level that's then starting to impact and create anti-patterns of avoidance throughout the organization. And that erodes psychological safety because in this example, the employee doesn't feel safe to give the feedback to the CTO. And so that's a problem.
Yeah, I remember being and it actually it wasn't co-founders, but it was a co-founder and an executive, like, very high level, and the executive had some huge career accomplishments, that kind of, you could say, I had outperformed, anyone else in the leadership team. And I always end up using these analogies it's like you're dealing with parents and divorce, but it was like they were two parents who hadn't divorced because, they're still whatever in the same org, but everything was like separated. And so it forced all of these teams to be inefficient because they couldn't partner together to build the things that it would make sense that they would partner together to build. And that all just stemmed from these two people not being able to kind of support one another and see eye to eye on anything. And, ends up like from a hiring perspective, I think, then you end up hiring 10 more people to do something, because the two groups couldn't collaborate. So they had to have their own people on this side and their own people on this side. Yeah. And it shows up in so many different ways in organizations. And the reality is we're all human, and it doesn't matter how many things you've succeeded in life. Like, people still carry shit around that like they need to work through. And unfortunately, that oftentimes takes a really long time to do.
I love how you articulated it because it's such an important example. And part of what I was hearing was, there's co-founder A, co-founder B, and these departments under each of them, and they're completely siloed. And in between the two, there are a lot of eggshells. And so to your point, then from a resourcing perspective and hiring, it becomes kind of a nightmare because there's not this cross-department collaboration. And so operating within the silos like that then leads to overhiring or other inefficiencies that really restrict the growth of the organization as a whole.
Yeah. And the ripple effects are for years. Like, I am still friends with so many people from that company, and the not keeping in touch, I guess, is an easy way to say it, between like people that I really like, who I think if they hadn't been part of that, they would have enjoyed working together so much more and would potentially work together again. But because of those dynamics, it's like, that divorce model, like, well, I'm on mom's side, I'm on dad's side, and so therefore, like, we can't be friends. So, okay, let's jump into vibe. And because, like, all of this kind of like connects to like that core of like how we feel about things, and sometimes that can be really hard to articulate. So so kind of what are some of those like hidden dynamics that people are picking up on, and how can you help like us understanding that feeling of the vibe is off?
Yeah, I think it goes right back to what the example you raised a few seconds ago, because like there were clearly all these unwritten and unspoken rules about communicating, and that created almost like a sibling rivalry in the organization. And that's something that's hard to capture. And certainly most people, maybe eventually they're talking about it as it reaches like a really critical level. But early on in the early stages of that happening, people aren't necessarily talking about it, but they are feeling it and nonetheless being impacted by it. Part of what I talk about with teams is the three languages all teams speak. So this is operational, psychological, and archetypal. And you'll see why I'm bringing this up in a second.
Say that again. So operational,
psychological,
and
archetypal.
Okay, so they all play together.
Yeah, and the languages are distinct in various ways. And so operational language is the language of business as the default setting. And so this is kind of focusing on KPIs, ROAS, kind of just the way that you typically run a business and the tone that you use, how you articulate it. It's not super resource intensive. It's the default setting of most teams, and it tends to be relatively rapid. And at times I'm kind of guilty now, since I work with so many startup founders. You'll notice I talk faster. And part of that is like the kind of pressure and urgency to continue the thought and to do the thing, and the bias toward action, all the rest of it. But psychological language is different. Psychological language is the language of emotion. It's internally, how am I feeling? It's internally, how are you feeling? And it's interpersonally, how are we operating and communicating together? And so it requires a fundamentally different skill set. It requires slowing down, building in a little bit more pauses, being more reflective and curious. And so just a quick aside, part of the issues I see most often with teams is that operationally, they might be arguing about product roadmap or hiring or firing or whatever the case may be. But what they're not articulating is what they're actually feeling under the surface, which are some of these psychological dynamics that they're getting stuck. Someone might not feel heard or understood or respected in the way that they want. And so then they're arguing about this business decision, when the real issue is the unspoken interpersonal dynamic between them. But to complete the thought, and then I would love to hear from you as well, the archetypal language is the language of the unconscious. This is the vibe. This is that gut level feeling whenever you walk into a room that tells you a lot of information about what's happening in the system. And so to give you an example, and then I'll try to apply it to this situation of hiring. If a co-founding team is arguing and not doing so well, whenever you walk in and you see your business partner, sometimes you feel a sense of dread of, oh gosh, or maybe walk on eggshells, this anxiety, like, oh, I hope you don't fight again today, or whatever the case may be. And then there's other times whenever you're in part of a high performing team, and I think everyone listening has been part of this, whether it's sports or music or something else. There's a sense of flow, this sense of effortless. We're all working together towards this common goal, and it can feel really enlivening. It's a really beautiful thing to experience that. Both polarities of that experience are telling you a lot of information about the health and well-being and the status of the team. And so when, as a candidate, you're getting a vibe, I encourage you to listen to it, because our nervous systems are built to detect some of those things going on in the environment to let us know, are we safe, are we not safe? And so that is really important context and information to consider when engaging in a process like interviewing.
So, okay. And I just brought that up, like when you're interviewing, you're already feeling nervous, and then you're talking about, and then listen to that vibe. So like, how I would think that people get really, really confused there. Like that, is this me or is this them? Am I feeling this way because like I'm so nervous? Like like my ADHD, part of it is that I'm just, I want to say like naturally anxious. So like, that's just like my natural state. It's not delightful. And so like, I'm already like dealing with that. Then you put like, thank God I don't interview I do the interviewing. I'm not interviewed off like in that way anymore since I have my own business now. I hated it. So like, but just like, even just like, I can actually like, I can feel it as we're talking about it, like that, like heavy, like something's like sitting on your chest, like the idea of having to be interviewed. Like, I can feel that heavy on your chest feeling. So you're already like combating that. And I guess what I would say, and like what I hear from a lot of candidates is, if that feeling can go away during an interview. So you may start your interview there and that's you. But you should end the interview feeling like you're having a conversation with someone that you would like you feeling more flow. And if you don't, then should you not keep interviewing with that company?
I love this question and appreciate how you articulate it. It reminds me so much. I used to, while I was going through graduate school, I would have to do, seriously, like four to six interviews per year for like, I think it was like a 4 or 5 year period. And so I was constantly doing these interviews, and they would be like full days on site and the rest of it. And part of what was so fascinating is I actually totally forgot this until you articulated it, which is I used to start with a lot of that performance anxiety and feel that exact same way in every scenario. Part of what I noticed was this kind of gradual dropping in and feeling a little bit less anxious and more present and able to engage. And then like these brief little moments of super intense anxiety if I would like stumble over my words or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, as I compared different settings, like if I was working at like this community mental health organization, for example, and doing a full day interview, there were moments where I did feel that connection in the sense of like, oh, like I can be myself here. And I see that they're kind of offering a little bit of themselves in various moments. It's brief interactions. And those interactions helped me then feel, I felt a little bit more at ease or whatever.
Yeah.
And other environments though, like I interviewed at like a jail, and I was like, immediately the vibe was just off. I was like, I don't know. And it just didn't feel congruent for whatever reason. And even though I feel like I did well in the interview and was able to manage my anxiety, I had never really felt that same sense of connection. And so to your point, I think, yeah, it's normal to have that degree of anxiety and concern. As you start to drop in, I think you get a little bit of a better flavor. And then also I want to normalize like those little spikes of anxiety that will continue to come up. But it's really, especially as you reflect on the day and of your experience, I think that's whenever a little bit more self-auditing and feeling in about, did I feel like there was an open and receptivity to some of my thoughts? Did I feel like I was put on trial the entire time? And some interviews are more like that than others. So I agree that this is a tricky problem and one that's challenging. There's no easy solution here. But what I guess my entire point is to try to listen to the way that your body feels, the way that you respond as much as possible, given the circumstances.
And there is this interesting thing that, when I'm talking with candidates, that they do better in interviews, that they do feel that connection. Now, part of that is because once they have that psychological safety, then they are better at answering questions. And so then I think they perform better as a candidate. So a lot of it, I think, can fall on the interviewer, and there's so little content on or training on how interviewers can do better. I myself, with this podcast, actually need to be putting out more content, and maybe we could talk about that at some time, about how to help someone create a feeling of psychological safety in an interview so that the other person can be their best selves. And so, so there's that whole dynamic of the interviewing and how that psychological safety can have both parties definitely go towards a yes. And when it's not there, a lot of times both parties end up going to a no. So let's talk about how to kind of get that, like vet the culture, vet psychological safety, not just purely from a vibe perspective. And so there's different people that we interview with when software engineers are interviewing. And so what should someone ask a engineer on the team? So this is like, in theory, someone that they'd be like working with, to gauge psychological safety.
I think part of the important point you're raising is that you can't just rely on the interviewer to give you a holistic understanding of psychological safety in the org. And so having multiple sources of information will help inform this. So that's one data point. How can you get a few more? As it pertains to the engineer, I think one thing that I'd be curious just to ask them, and this is a good question for most people as well, but specific to them, is, when someone makes a mistake, how is it handled? And that's one, like, obviously people can BS and kind of come up with things, but what you're really listening for is kind of curiosity or blame, or like, do they joke or deflect, or is there like a subtle laugh? Are they vague? Do they not have the ability to articulate it? All of that, again, is helpful information that will also give you a feeling in response of like, is this something that they care about? Is this something that they think through or not?
Okay, say the question again.
Question is, when someone makes a mistake, how's it handled?
Okay, when someone makes a mistake, how's it handled? Okay, and I will say that question is one that that you're potentially triggering a bomb if you answer it in a certain way. So as you said that, I thought of a softer way to potentially ask that question would be, when and how do you go about the process of communicating that you're stuck? Because getting stuck as an engineer, I think, is common. Or like, when do you normally ask questions? Like, which is really, really light. And like, I don't think the other person thinks that they're in any way, like, in like, exposing of any cultural problems in the org. And so I know I'm switching the question that you asked on you. But what is a right and wrong answer around that kind of concept of like mistakes, asking questions, getting feedback when you're stuck?
I think wrong answers there's the obvious stuff. If they're like, yeah, they came down really hard or whatever, which, to your point, they're incentivized not to share with you.
Yeah.
I'm thinking more kind of behaviorally and emotionally. What am I feeling? And do I sense like they're deflecting and they're kind of giving me some BS lip service? To me, that's whenever my little radar is going to be going off. I'm like, ooh, like, okay, feels like they just BS'd me. Like, so I might not press on it in the moment because, for whatever reason, but I'm gonna say, oh, that actually doesn't feel solid and steady. If they have a response where they're like, yeah, like this happens all the time. Here's what it looks like.
I apologize. I'm going to pause for a second. So, okay, identifying BS, is that because they're typically giving a high level answer? Like I know, like I think you're saying like your BS radar goes off, but like I don't think everybody's great at having that radar.
Mm-hmm.
How can we like help people, like help them understand like what it should feel, what it shouldn't feel like, what it should feel like.
It should feel like they are confident and calm in their response.
Okay.
And if it feels like they are not, then I think that that's an important indicator.
Okay. So it's if you're getting a sense that they are moving around and not answering the question, there's probably a problem.
Yes.
Okay. And I will say that, like I had said, I will give you that sense of psychological safety even if I'm in a work environment that like shit is hitting the fan and like we're all just waiting to get laid off. That if you ask me questions kind of related to that, I definitely sidestepped. Because you can't be honest. Okay, so let's talk about hiring managers. What are things that would be good to ask the hiring manager? And in this scenario, let's assume that the hiring manager is not the co-founder.
I think we should do the same game as last time. I think I'm going to say the direct route, and then I want you to help me translate it, because it seems like you have a degree of kind of finessing or massaging the question in a way that I don't. I just know how to go straight for it. So the thing that came to my mind was, just because again, I mean, this is the stuff that I care about and that I'm really curious about, which is like, tell me about a time that there was a harsh or challenging feedback to leadership and like how it was handled. So just directly to it. I want to know, because I think part of how I think about organizational health is the ability for information to flow bidirectionally. And so giving that, going up the chain of command, so to speak, and articulating some challenges, I think is something that's healthy and important. And so to me, a good organization is one that's able to metabolize that, digest it, and then come back with new ideas or solutions to unblock people. And so that's not happening. I think that's a problem. So I think about the direct question there of, can you tell me about a time, just to repeat one more time, where someone gave hard feedback to leadership and how it was handled?
Yeah. And I think like if you can get an honest, good answer to that, that is an amazing sign. I think a softer way to ask that question would be start with a positive, which is, can you tell me about a time an engineer had an idea about the product and that idea was implemented? It would have to be that idea required leadership approval and was implemented. So that has that kind of getting at that bottom up. And then the next question could be, and was there a time that an engineer or someone on the team had an idea that leadership needed to approve and leadership did not approve it?
Yeah, I love how specific those examples are. I think you get a lot of really helpful responses.
Yeah. And I know these questions are so are hard to come up with on the spot. Even just us doing this right now in this like space where we're not, risking if we're going to get hired or not. So it is something that takes practice. And I think that, candidates really should be practicing and thinking through these types of questions outside of this, kind of stressful interview environment. Okay. And then to me, it's like kind of obvious, kind of what those answers, basically the answer is that there is answers to me to those questions. Anything else that you think like kind of what the candidate is looking for.
No, I think that's right. In this example, you really are looking at the content and hoping that there's, like, especially with the questions you asked, specific responses there. Like, I think I would be if they were just like, oh no, like I can't think of a single time that engineer feedback impacted product or it's like that would not be good, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I will say one thing that's tricky is a lot of hiring managers can be new. And so they can easily deflect or they're maybe not deflecting because they don't have the example yet. So if you're with a hiring manager that was new and you're assessing psychological safety, I guess like a turn question could be, what was something that you asked when you were interviewing that had you feel this was an organization that you were going to be supported in?
That's nice.
Yeah, because that is, and it is that having to like pivot because not always, everybody doesn't always have an answer to those hard questions. If someone's been there 3 years and they don't have an answer to that question, that's your answer. Okay, so ego is something that I think is important in thinking about founders. It's a complicated one because I think you have to have a healthy ego to found a startup. But ideally not an unhealthy ego. So I would want to ask something around, what is a early success that you didn't expect? And then I would be paying attention to how much credit they're giving to the team in that answer. And then the follow-up would be, what's an early failure that you learned from? And that's such even as I say that, I'm like, like I'd be so uncomfortable asking that. Like if I'm about to get an offer, like I need to make my mortgage next month, and asking that to a founder.
Is the fear that you would like upset them, or what's the fear?
Just like, yeah, that I guess if they have a big ego, that would make them feel pretty uncomfortable. I guess if you're talking to a technical co-founder, which ideally they are, what was something technically that when you started this company that you thought was going to take like a couple weeks and a couple people to fix, that ended up taking months? And I think that's a pretty safe question because there's no way they don't have an example. Like, I think that's such a common problem.
Yeah, and I think you could also ask about pivots and how those went.
Yeah. Yeah. So anything that that is like related to changes in the company and the dynamics there are helpful. Also, as far as being a good candidate, trying to watch a podcast episode that they were on, or, and sometimes gosh, I just interviewed someone the other week and I pulled up this, which I wish I had before I'd interviewed him for the podcast. He has a TED talk that he did 15 years ago. And so that if I could refer to, oh, I saw you, in that TED talk when you talked about da, 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 and, and how is your views on that? It's been 10 years. How have your views on that changed? So, cause I think that whole change, trying to get to at change, growth, all of those things, you want to see, right, that what you talked about, that there's no BS filter happening, or not BS filter, that they're not just bullshitting some candid, high level answer to you, that they're being their authentic self. Mm-hmm. And do you think a lot of founders are their authentic selves with candidates?
Honestly, I think so. I think you end up seeing a good amount, and it does depend on the founder. Like there's some founders who walk around kind of polished and kind of always on their game, so to speak. And so that's part of it. But a lot of founders that I speak with have perhaps elements of that, but also elements where you're, I mean, that's how they are most of the time. Like you're kind of still seeing those parts of them that you'd want to see. But I will say broadly that I agree that if things feel way too overly polished, that's not helpful.
Okay, and that's what I was wondering when you said like, because a lot of founders are polished and on their game, but I don't think that's a bad thing. So how do you get a sense of psychological safety from someone who is really polished?
I think it's hard. I mean, so to answer this question, part of what's coming to mind is I spoke with a product person yesterday who has, just the best Silicon Valley resume you could imagine, like worked with just the famous CEOs of the world. And part of what was fascinating was he didn't let his guard down 1 second of that call. And so everyone else who I've talked to about this person thinks that he's, really fantastic and open and humble and all this stuff. And I was like, maybe. I mean, he was incredibly superficially pleasant. He was, easy to talk to somewhat. And shared a lot of his experiences and perspectives. But anytime I tried to get him to be more direct and give me feedback or kind of help me understand more about some of his challenges or whatever, there was no openness there, even though it sounded fantastic and it sounded polished. And so that to me conveyed that he lacked psychological safety with me. Something about the context of our conversation, and that this wasn't a space where he felt he could open up, which is fine. But I bring it up because to me, I guess I do read into it, and so whenever I'm with people, I am kind of making note of does it feel performative, or even if they are having moments of performance where it's kind of like they're going off on their tangent, like Lord knows I do. Then do we get back to something real after that? Is there this moment of okay, I see the human in front of me?
Yeah, and it makes me think of when you were at the beginning of this episode, which is longer than I intended, when we were talking about I am great at forgetting words, your three languages. You talked about operational, which I was like, oh yeah, I hear that all the time. That's such startup when everything that you said about psychological, I was just like, oh, that is not startup world at all. And this is coming from a recruiter who in theory we're in the safe, fluffy HR bubble, which is not safe or fluffy. Because the psychological components of it just it's so far from how leadership functions in a startup. And I worked in nonprofits before I worked in startups. So whatever, and not all nonprofits have anything close to psychological safety. But the idea of the psychological in a startup it feels so far from anything that I've experienced that I kind of think it's a lot of very, and I will say this, as a woman and mom in tech, it's a lot of very buttoned up men who I don't think have ever talked to a psychologist in their entire lives. And they're pretty unaware of anything related to psychological safety. And so, yeah, how do you but that doesn't mean that they're horrible to work with by any means. I mean, some of them are, but
I think so broadly, yeah, let's say that the stereotype has some degree of truth, which, it does. And there's a lot of broiness to the culture and anti-mental health and other things, and concerns about how they'll be perceived from an investment lens and otherwise if they were using those resources. So it's a challenging place, but I guess part of what comes to mind for me is, again, even if it does feel like they lack some degree of self-awareness or are overly polished in the way that we're saying can be problematic for psychological safety reasons, I still come back to, is this a leader I can trust?
Okay.
Is this someone I can believe in? Is this someone that I can imagine myself working for and enjoying working with?
Okay.
Even if what I'm seeing is who they are, and there's a degree of that's coming through, is that okay with me? Or is there a gut feeling that this isn't someone that I want to work with? Like there's something that's incongruent. Because what we're really doing is we're trying to catch the red flags for the personalities that later are going to be far more difficult to manage.
Yeah.
So if we can even just save a couple of those red flags, that's well worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great point. I reflect of even, now that I've shifted into, being a consultant and coming on short term to work with startups, the ones that I felt not great with probably weren't the best ones to work with, from the get-go. The ones that I felt good with, those are the founders I still text and chat with, and that just makes a better environment. And ideally people hold out, until they find that, because having that psychological safety will just help them be a happier, healthier person every day at work, not have to look for that next job as quick. And that healthy piece is huge. I think I triggered a health problem that I'll have for the rest of my life, due to being in an environment that I didn't feel that I could be myself in, which sucks. So it's so critical. So last question. I am about to join a 10-person startup, and I get one shot to assess whether the team is emotionally healthy. What's the one question I should ask and the one gut feeling I shouldn't ignore?
I think a question could be, and I would love to hear if you would ask it differently. So I'm thinking 10-person startup. This is really early. Most people at this stage, if you're joining, are opting in. So these are people who ideally have a lot of shared values relative to some people who might come in later. And so you could ask about that. What are the shared collective values of this team? And can you tell me about them? Another route that is my more direct route is, when's the last time that you guys had a hard conversation? What was it? What was it about? How'd you navigate it? Because we all have hard conversations, and especially in a 10-person startup, there's moments where decisions have to be made and calls about product and engineering and the resourcing. There's constraints already in the business. So trying to understand how they handle the friction that's there would be beneficial. And then the overall feeling not to ignore, and I think this is part of what we've been circling all day, is don't ignore it if something is telling you that the vibe is off. In particular, if people are too vague, too cheerful, and not answering your questions, and you're left there saying oh, they just gave me words, but nothing actually landed. That's a sign. That's not safety. That's kind of missing the feeling beneath the words.
Yeah, and that feeling of it doesn't feel safe. It makes me also think of job security and how I hear about people getting, and I haven't heard about this for a while because we're kind of in a new hiring space these days, but candidates getting kind of crazy offers, and the offer was hiding the fact that shit is an absolute disaster. And so it's almost the so here you have this candidate who's picking up on all of that vibe. People this feels off. And I think you've done such a great job of helping understand the why you're getting that vibe feel. And then you put on top of that, but this offers $40,000 more than the offer at this other company. And I think that offers 40,000 more because the vibe is off and there are things being hidden that you probably need to have a really high risk tolerance for, and not let anything emotionally impact you to be able to make that 40,000 worth it. So.
And there's a trade-off there. That comes down to personal values and situations and context. And there's moments in life where you might say, yeah, give me the extra. And there's other moments where you might discover that that's not a worthwhile sacrifice.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I have loved this conversation. It's been very fun, like kind of like playing around with like what to think about, to ask, and really just, I think we're not talking about psychological safety enough. And especially in this time where I think a lot of candidates have PTSD from being laid off. And I think a lot of them need to get some therapy to work through that. But it's also very important for people who are coming off of layoffs, horrible work experiences, to have the tools to be able to make sure that they're picking a safe work environment for their next role. We haven't mentioned your book, so we should do that.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah. So I've written a book on co-founding teams and communication and all of that fun stuff called The Co-Founder Effect. And it's available on Amazon, and I hope you'll check it out.
Yes. And I will include I'll include a link to your website in the description for this episode, so that people can go and find out about that. And then would love to, have another episode with you sometime in the future. So thank you so much.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.